This morning, we continue our journey with Jesus after the feeding of the 5,000. 3 weeks ago, Jesus had a crowd around him, and he miraculously fed them with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And then he proceeded to go off. And last week, we found that the followers weren't satisfied just being fed. They wanted to have their questions answered, so they followed him. This week, we pick up right where we left off. The crowd is starting to get smaller, and right now, Jesus is listening to his followers complain. It's been a few days since they've been fed. Maybe it's time for something new. And so Jesus decides, I've fed you and showed you who I am. I've answered your questions about who I am. And yet, you still continue to ask questions. So therefore, I'm going to go all in. He jumped in the deep end of the swimming pool, hoping that his followers would understand. Because what Jesus says is, I am the bread of life. I am the person that has come down from God, and I am going to feed you. But Jesus isn't just talking about physical feeding. He's talking spiritual feeding as well. For us, the Eucharistic feeding is a sacrament. According to our prayer book, in the back, not our prayer book, in our catechism on page 859, in the back of our prayer book, it says that the Eucharist is a gospel sacrament commanded by Christ for the continual remembrance of his life, death, resurrection, until his coming again. The Eucharist is a continual remembrance, but it's a sacrament. And sacraments have outward and visible signs of inward spiritual grace. So the outward signs are the bread and the wine. They are the sign of Christ's body and blood. The inward spiritual grace is the body and blood of Christ given for his people, received by our faith. The Eucharist is a time for us to remember God among us. A time for us to remember that Jesus Christ is the bread sent from heaven. Jesus is the incarnation itself. God's intervention into the world around us. God became human. God became human because As God, we can't fathom what God is capable of doing. God is unknowable. But as God incarnate, Jesus Christ is a person, a human like all of us, and yet also divine. And so for his listeners then and us now, Jesus is saying to us, come to me to know God. Come to me, and I will feed your hunger. Come to me, and I will quench your thirst. For those people who don't like having a God on earth as one of us, that could be rather scary. But yet, here is the God in flesh before each of us, saying, I'm your bread. Feed on me. As we gather around the altar for the Eucharist every Sunday, Jesus invites us to feed on him, to remember what he did, the great accomplishments. Jesus is the bread of life. The bread of life for a world that is hungry. Hungry for life and thirsty for salvation. And when we accept the invitation of Christ to come to his table, we enjoy his feast. We follow him. And we follow God. In Christ, the bread of life, the manna from heaven, the incarnation of God, the cosmic order is reordered. It is remade for humanity. The gift Christ gives us is the gift of life. The gift of knowing our God. The gift of being welcomed to that feast, that on the last day we will be welcomed home. We will sit at that banquet table and we will celebrate with all those that have gone before us. And for that, I say thanks be to God.